Hello, good evening, and welcome to another stream. Yes, hello. Give me uno secondo. Hi. Sorry. Good mythical evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to another stream and another week where we're gonna continue with the second volume of Spice&Wolf. Yes. Sorry. A bit distracted. Alright. I hope you're having a lovely evening. Sorry, started a bit later than usual. Was busy with some other stuff. Yeah, I hope you're having a good night. I am having a fantastic night. Been very busy today. Starting a new project, which I finished. Or at least a part of it. But yeah. Wait up a bit more. I'm gonna open a window real quick. Quite warm in here. Yes. Let me turn down the music. There we go. Bit less loud. Alright. Well, we're already a bit late, so without further ado, I'm probably just gonna start. Where people roll in later, they can always watch it back. Yeah. Last time we finished with the couple fleeing, or at least not necessarily fleeing the city, but they were fleeing from the Medio company and were almost caught. Hollow had some dramatic reveal of her wolf form, and yeah, everything ended on quite a happy note, but the pair a decently bit richer. So, hmm. All right, I'm just gonna continue. The rolling hills continued endlessly. Boulders were prominent, grass and trees were few. The road wound thinly between the hills, frequently becoming so narrow that even a single cart was enough to block it entirely. Just when it seemed the climbing would continue forever, the road turned down, and the seemingly endless naked rocks and dried shrubs suddenly changed into a wide awaiting vista. While the journey had been more than interesting and than endless grass plains, most anyone would find the travel tiresome by the fifth day. From the road, tinged with loneliness that suggested the coming winter, a voice that once sounded its delight at the undulations of the stony ochre path was now gone. Its owner now apparently too bored to even sit on the bench of the cart. She lay instead in a bed, grooming the fur of her tail. A young man drove the cart, apparently used to such selfish behavior on the part of his companion. The man, Kraft Lawrence, was instantly recognizable as a traveling merchant. This year made the seventh since struck out on his own, and he had appeared to be around 25. As if in acknowledgement of the chill that came with the deepening autumn, they tightened the fur coat. He tightened the fur coat that was wrapped around his body. Occasionally, the chill would also cause him to stroke his chin, covered with a short beard one often saw on traveling merchants. Since he sat, since he sat still, he slightly became cooler, letting a breath escape that would have turned foggy once the sun set. Lawrence glanced over his shoulder at the bed of the cart. Normally filled to the brim with various goods, the bed was enjoying a brief respite. One stood, one stood out. One that all that stood out was the firewood and straw that provided warmth at night, along with a single bag. Enough to fill, enough for a child to carry, small enough for a child to carry. However, the contents of the bag were more valuable than an entire cart full of wheat would have been. The bag was full of high-grade paper worth roughly 1,000 silver trenny. If it could be sold in a mountain tow, it might fetch as much as 1,700 pieces, but the bag was currently being used as a pillow by Lawrence's companion, who continued lazily grooming her tail. She was small, with a face that somehow imperious was somehow imperious despite its apparent youth, reminiscent of a queen relaxing in her palace. The hood of her robe was thrown back, exposing her pointed ears she was as she attended to her tail, her expressions listless. Given the tail, the pointed ears, and the fact that her status of merchant's traveling companion, one might reasonably think of a dog, but unfortunately she was no dog. She was apparently a wise wolf, a wolf god from the taiga in the distant north, but Lawrence felt there was some question as to whether she could be properly called a wolf. After all, this wolf appeared to be a young girl. calling her a wolf seemed slightly inaccurate. "We'll be reaching the town soon. Be careful," he said. It would seem disastrous for the girl's ears and tail to be seen by others. Truth was, her canineness would put the instincts of even the sharpest merchant to shame. Thus, Lawrence didn't need to warn her of the danger. However, he was so thoroughly relaxed. She was so thoroughly relaxed that he simply had to speak up. Not so much as glancing at him. She only yawned hugely. Her yawn concluding with a vacant exhalation, she now nibbled puppy-like on the snow-white tip of her dark brown tail, as though it itched. She did not appear to have the slightest inclination to be careful. Having introduced herself as a wolf possessing these ears and tail, Holo certainly relaxed with the carelessness of an animal, if nothing else. A slight vocalization that could have been a reply, or could have simply be a small utterance of satisfaction at having conquered the itch, reached Lawrence's ears. Tired of waiting for her reply, he looked forward. Holo and Lawrence had met 2 weeks earlier. Owing to a strange event in one of the villages Lawrence stopped at. Holo had joined him, and the two had been traveling together since. With the ears and tail, she was currently regarded as an evil spirit, and the church sought out to end her life to preserve order. Lawrence had not a shred of doubt that she was in fact a wolf rather than a simple girl who happened to have wolf ears and a tail. Just 9 days earlier, in the river town of Pazio, as a riot of silver chasing had come to a close, he had seen her true form. The huge brown wolf named Holo had understood human speech and possessed an overwhelming presence that was undeniably that of a god. Yet Lawrence believed his relationship with Holo the Wise Wolf to be one of money, of partners in lending and borrowing, of companions in travel and friends. He had looked behind him again, and Holo appeared to be curled up in sleep. Although her legs were covered by the pants she wore under her robe, and the robe was still hitched up around her waist from the tail grooming earlier. There was no denying the fact that the sight was slightly less vicious. Her sleeping expression was the very picture of defenselessness, and coupled with her slight form, Holo looked less like a wolf and more like the sort of girl a wolf was likely to eat. Nevertheless, Lawrence did not take her lightly. Her wolf ears pricked suddenly, and she stirred, pulling her hood over her head and drawing the edge of the rope to cover her tail. Lawrence looked ahead just as the road drew near the face of the hill and curved. Before them, the figure of a single merchant on foot could be seen. Cautioning Holo had indeed been unnecessary. Holo the Wise Wolf was hundreds of years old, and the young man's 25 years of experience were far from sufficient to make him her equal. However, Holo looked to be the younger of the two, with her true age being many times greater than what she appeared to be, a fact that occasionally irritated Lawrence. It was Lawrence's hope that Holo would act more in keeping with him, with the apparent difference between their ages, obediently minding him when she was told. A variant of problems could have been avoided this way, and the wolf would have him to thank for this, but unfortunately, the opposite was much more common. Lawrence glanced back. Sorry. Lawrence glanced back at the cart bed once more. Despite the superstitious nature of Lawrence's backward peak, Hollow returned his look from where she lay, curled up around the bag of pepper. She threw him a mean-spirited grin, as if to say that yes, she could see everything ahead just fine. Before closing her eyes once more, Lawrence looked back at to the road. Perhaps enjoying the cart ride, Hollow still flicked back and forth. The town ahead bore a strange name bore the strange name of Poroson. Beyond the town, to the north and east, they would travel toward towns and villages that lay many days beyond the highland in the foreground. The dress and food of the people would change. Even the gods worshipped would be different. The pair would find themselves in a truly foreign land. Lawrence had heard that Poroson was until recently known as a gateway to another world. Descending to the west of these rock-strewn highlands, one would find abundantly fertile forested lands in all directions, yet the land hemmed in as it was by the surrounding rocks, which yielded little spring water, was difficult to farm. The only reason to take the trouble of founding a town here was its position as a gateway to another world. They continued through the fields. Lawrence could hear the faint cries of goats. Sorry. Through the morning haze as he counted the many gravestone-like posts he saw. The posts were carved with names of many generations of sages in the church's long history, and continue to purify the land even now. Long before it was known as a gateway to another world, Poroson was a holy land to certain pagan faith. Many years had passed since the church, following the will of its gods, sent missionaries to convert the heathens, starting a war to purify this land tainted by impure beliefs. Poroson was a psychological turn. Sorry about that. Oh my god. Poroson was a holy land to a certain... Oh, we got that. Poroson was a psychological turning point in the process of the destruction of the old faith. Once the church was on the verge of wiping out the pagan faith in the area, the priest commanded that the town be founded there. Poroson soon became the staging area for the missionaries and knights heading north and east after the remaining pagans, and it came to reputation of after the remaining pagans, and it became to have the reputation of a crossroads for both goods and people. The missionaries with their tattered hermit-like robes and the knights with their righteous swords in hand, ready to reclaim the land in the name of their god, were now gone. All that passed through the town these days were the woven goods, salt and iron from the north, and the east of the north and east, and the grain and leather from the south and west. The holy wars of the past were long gone, replaced by the continuous comings and goings of the shrewd merchants. Hollow's presence was made it necessary for Lawrence to take roads with little traffic, but along certain ancient trade routes they continually passed carts laden with rare goods. Many of the textiles they saw were particularly fine quality. Despite the brisk trade, Proson was rather modest, thanks to the habits of its residents. The wealth of commerce provided for a magnificent wall around the town, but the buildings within were of humble stone construction, their roofs thatched with straw. It's true that wherever goods and people intersect, money will be left behind and the area will prosper, but Proson's circumstances were slightly different. The residents were all highly devout and gave most of their money to the church. Furthermore, Proson was not the holding of particular nation, but rather of a religious capital of Uruvingegen to the northwest. So tithes did not stay in the town's own church, but instead flowed to the larger city. In fact, the church's office managed land taxes as well. So Proson did not even control its own tax revenue. The residents of the town had no interest in anything beyond their own humble lives. When a bell sounded through the morning haze, the workers in the fields paused in all their labors and turned to face the south, putting their hands together and closing their eyes. In a typical town at this hour, red-faced merchants would be busy jockeying for positions in the town square, but there was no such rude commotion. Not wanting to intrude upon the residents' prayers, Lawrence stopped his cart horse. Then, putting his hands together, he offered a prayer to his own god. The bell rang for a second time, and when the people returned to their work, Lawrence made his cart horse walk again. Suddenly, Hollow spoke. "Oh, so you are a religious man now, are you? I'll pray to anyone who can promise me safe travels and tidy profits." "I can promise you a fine harvest." Hollow faced Lawrence as he glanced at her out the corner of his eye. "You want me to pray to you, then?" Hollow knew and hated the loneliness felt by gods. Lawrence believed she couldn't possibly be serious, but ventured to ask. He suspected she was joking with him out of boredom. As expected, her reply came purposefully sweet voice. "Yes, I certainly do." "What shall I pray for, then?" asked Lawrence, by now used to this sort of treatment from Hollow. "Whatever you like. I can provide a bountiful harvest, naturally, but safe travels are also no problem for me. I can predict the winds and rain and tell whether spring water is good or bad. And I'm just the thing for getting rid of wolves and wild dogs." She sounded just like the village youth extolling his virtues to a merchant guild. But Lawrence thought for a moment before answering. "I suppose safe travels would be worth praying for." "They would they not?" answered Hollow with a satisfied smile, inclining her head slightly. Seeing her carefree, innocent smile, Lawrence wondered whether she wasn't simply trying to praise her own abilities over the god of the church. Every once in a while, Hollow exhibited a certain childishness. "Well, I suppose I'll ask for safe travels then. It would be heartening to be able to avoid wolves." Safe travels, is it?" "Indeed." Lawrence tugged on the reins to avoid a donkey grazing on the grass. The gateway to the town walls would be upon them soon. The end of the line for people waiting for inspection was visible, even in the morning mist. Though the entire town was part of the church, many merchants came to it from pagan lands, so Proson was remarkably accommodating. Its inspection of goods was much stricter than its inspection of people. Lawrence was considering the tax likely to be levied on the pepper he carried when he became aware of someone looking at him from the side. There was only Hollow. What? Is that all? What? Is that all? Her voice sounded slightly irritated. Hmm? I'm asking if all you require is safe travel. Staring blankly at Hollow for a few moments, Lawrence realized what she was talking about. What? You wanted me to put my hands together and pray? Don't be ridiculous, she said with a vexed glare. I'm guaranteeing you safe travel. Surely you don't think that a single useless prayer is compensation enough. Lawrence's mind turned like a water wheel as he arrived at the obvious conclusion. Ah, you want an offering. Hollow gave a self-satisfied chuckle. What do you want then? Dried mutton. You gorged yourself on the stuff yesterday. It must have been a week's worth you ate. I've always room for more mutton. Never shy, Hollow licked her chops as at the memory of the meat. It seemed even the noble wolf was a mere dog when presented with dried victuals. Cooked meat is good too. Cooked meat is good too, but I simply cannot resist the texture of dried meat. If you would pray for safe travels, dry mutton is the price. Hollow's eyes blazed and her tail twitched restlessly underneath her robe. Lawrence ignored this completely and instead looking at the goods loaded on the horse. That was being led by the merchant in front of them. The horse's back was piled high with a mountain of wool. What about that wool? Is it good or bad? Wool evidently suggested sheep. Hollow looked at the mountain of wool, her eyes brimming with anticipation before answering quickly, It's quite good. So good I can almost smell the grass they ate. I thought as much. My pepper should fetch a good price here. If the wool was of high quality, the meat would be excellent too. And if the quality of meat rose, so did its price. Expensive meat made this pepper, which could be used as a flavor and preserve it, all the more valuable. And Lawrence began to look forward to selling his wares. Also, dried meat with lots of salt is good. Just a little bit of salt will do. Also, the meat from the flanks is the best. Better than the meat from the legs. Here now, are you listening? Salted meat from the flanks. You have excellent taste. That'll cost us. Huh, tis a bargain at twice the price. It was true that some good mutton was a bargain if it meant Hollow would guarantee safe travels. After all, her true form was a giant talking wolf. She could probably even protect him from the kind of ill-mannered soldiers that were hard to distinguish from out-and-out thieves. Nonetheless, Lawrence assumed a purposefully blank expression as he regarded Hollow. Her eyes were fixed greedily upon the imagined food. He couldn't help but tease her. Well now, you must have quite a bit of money indeed. If you got so much, perhaps you should repay me. Yet his opponent was a canine wise wolf. She soon discerned his motive. Her demeanor tightened suddenly as she glared at him. That approach will no longer work. Apparently she had learned from the apple incident. Lawrence clicked his tongue in irritation, his face grim. You should have just asked nicely in the first place. Then it would have been much more charming. So if I ask nicely, if I ask charmingly enough, you will buy some for me then? Asked Hollow without a trace of charm. Lawrence eased the horse forward as the line moved, answering flatly, "Of course not. You could stand to learn something from those cows and sheep. Try chewing your cud. Hmm?" He grinned to himself, proud of his wit, but Hollow's face went blank with anger. And without a word there on the driver's seat of the wagon, she stomped on his foot. The road was nothing more than hard-packed dirt, simply the simple houses made of rough-hewn stone and thatched with grass. The people in Proson bought nothing but the barest necessities from the merchant stalls. So there were surprisingly few such stalls. A goodly number of people moved about the town. Among them, merchants with carts or bags fully loaded, but the atmosphere seemed to suck up the normal town chatter like cotton, so it was oddly quiet. It was hard to believe this quiet, simple, proud town was a nexus of foreign trade that earned dizzying amounts of money every day. After all, missionaries whose street corner sermons went largely ignored in other cities could count on gratefully attentive crowds here. So how was profit so efficiently made? To Lawrence the town was nothing less than a mystery. "It's a tedious place," came Hollow's assessment of the uniquely religious town. "You're only saying that because there's nothing to eat." "You speak as though I think of nothing else." "Shall we take in a sermon, then?" Just ahead of them a missionary preached to the crowd, one hand on the book of scriptures. The listeners were not only townspeople, but there were several merchants whose prayers went normally for naught but their own profit. Hollow regarded them distastefully and sniffed. "He's about 500 years too young to be preaching to me. I dare say you could stand to hear the sermon on frugality." Toying idly with the silken sash at her waist, Hollow put her hand to her mouth and yawned at Lawrence's suggestion. "I'm a wolf, yet sermons are I'm a wolf yet. Sermons are complicated and difficult for us to understand," she said shamelessly, rubbing her eyes. "Well, as far as teachings of the gods of frugality go, they're more persuasive here than anywhere else, I'd reckon. Hmm? Nearly all the money made here flows to the seat of the church, northwest of here. Ruvenhagen. Now there's a place I've no desire to hear a sermon." The church's capital of Ruvenhagen was so prosperous some said its walls had turned to gold. The upper echelons of the church council that controlled the region had turned to commerce to support their subjugation of the heathens, and the bishops of Ruvenhagen put the merchants to shame. Lawrence wondered if that was precisely why opportunities for profit there were so absurdly plentiful. Just then, Hollow tilted her head quizzically. "Did you say Ruvenhagen?" "What, do you know it?" Lawrence gave Hollow a sidelong glance as he steered the wagon to the right once the street forked. I remember the name, but not as a city. It was a person's name." Ah, you're not wrong. It's a city now, but it was the name of a saint who led a group of crusaders against the pagans. It's an old name. You don't hear it much anymore. Heh, maybe 'tis him. I'm remembering. Surely not. Lawrence laughed it off, but soon realized Hollow had set out her travels hundreds of years ago. He was a man with flaming red hair and a great bushy beard. He'd hardly gotten a glance of my lovely ears until before he sent his knights after me with spear and sword. I'd had enough, so I took my other form and kicked his knights around before sinking my teeth in that Reuvenhagen's backside. He was rather lean, far from tasty. Rather lean and far from tasty. Hollow sniffed proudly as she related the gallant tale. The surprised Lawrence had no response. The holy city of Reuvenhagen, in the holy city of Reuvenhagen, there were records of the Saint Reuvenhagen having red hair, and the city itself having originally been a fortress that fought against pagan gods. However, in his battles against the heathen deities, Saint Reuvenhagen was said to have lost his left arm. That's why on the great mural of the city cathedral, he was pictured with no left arm, his ragged clothing smeared with blood, resolutely ordering his crusaders forward against the pagans, the protection of God at their backs. Perhaps the reason Saint Reuvenhagen was always pictured in clothes so ragged he might be as well be nude was because Hollow had shredded them. Her true form was a massive wolf after all. It was easy to imagine her bloodying someone after a bit of sport. If what Hollow said was true, Saint Reuvenhagen had probably been ashamed of being bitten in his rear and had omitted that bit from the story. In that case, the tale of the saint losing his left arm was pure fabrication. Had Hollow bitten the real Saint Reuvenhagen? Hearing the story behind the history, Lawrence chuckled. Oh, but wait a moment, said Hollow. I only bit him. I'll have you know, I did not kill him, said Hollow, quickly anticipating Lawrence's reaction. For a moment Lawrence didn't understand what she was getting at, but soon he realized. She must have assumed that he would be angry if she killed one of his fellow humans. You're considered the strangest of times, said Lawrence. 'Tis important, said Hollow, her face serious enough that Lawrence capitulated without any further teasing. Anyways, this surely is a tedious city. In the middle of the forest is livelier than this. I'll unload my pepper and pick up a new commodity, and then we'll be on our way to Reuvenhagen. So just bear with it until then. Is it a big town? Bigger even than Pazio. More prosperously a city than a town, really. More properly, a city than a town, really. It's crowded and there are lots of shops. Hollow's face lit up. Even with apples? Hard to say if they'll be fresh with winter coming. I think they'd be preserved. Preserved? Said Hollow, dubious. In Northland, salt was the only method of preservation, so she assumed preserved apples would also use salt. They use honey. Pop went Hollow's ears, flicking rapidly under the hood she wore. Pear preserves are good too. Pear preserves are good too. Also, they're a bit rare, but I've seen preserved peaches. Now those are fine goods. They slice the peaches thin, pack them in a cask with an odd layer of almonds or figs, then fill up the spaces with honey and seal it shut. It takes about 2 months for it to be ready to eat. I've only had it once, but It was so sweet the church was considering banning the stuff. Hey, you're drooling. Ola snapped her mouth shut as Lawrence pointed it out. She took a nervous glance around, then looked back at Lawrence dubiously. You're toying with me, though. Can't you tell if I'm lying or not? Holo set her jaw, perhaps at a loss for words. I'm not lying, but there's no telling whether they'll actually have the preserves. They're mostly for rich nobles anyway. The stuff isn't just lined up in the shops. But if it is? Swish, swish. Holo's tail was switching back and forth beneath her robe so rapidly it almost seemed a separate animal altogether. Her eyes were moist and blurred with overflowing anticipation. Holo's face was so close to Lawrence's that she rested her head on his shoulder. Her eyes were desperately serious. Fine, fine, I'll buy some. Holo gripped Lawrence's arm tightly. You have to. He felt that if he looked sideways at her, he'd be bitten on the spot. A little though, just a little, Lawrence said. It was not clear if Holo was listening or not. That's a promise then. You've promised. Okay, okay. So let's hurry then. Hurry now. Stop grabbing me. Lawrence shrugged her off, but Holo's mind had wandered elsewhere. She seemed to look off into the distance and muttered as she nibbled on the nail of her middle finger. They may sell out, should it come to that. Lawrence was beginning to regret having said anything about honeyed peach preserves, but it was too late for such regrets. If he dared to suggest he had decided not to buy any after all, it seemed likely she'd tear out his throat. Hi, Pigeon. Fighting with your heater. It didn't matter that honeyed peaches preserves weren't something that traveling merchants could afford. It's not a question of selling out. They may not have any, Lawrence said. Just understand that. We're talking about those peaches and honey, sir. It's beggar's belief, peaches and honey. Are you even listening to me? Still, it's hard to give up pears, said Holo, turning to Lawrence and looking up at him. Lawrence's only reply was to heave a long, suffering sigh. Lawrence planned to sell his pepper to the Lat Paron trading company, whose name was every bit as odd as the town in which it was located, Paroson. If one were to trace the name, it would surely harken all the way back to the time Paroson was a town and only pagans inhabited the areas. The strange names were all that remained of the past, though, after all, everyone here was a true believer in the church. From the tops of their heads to the tips of their toes, the Let Paron company would soon have its 50th master, and each seemed to be more devout than the last. Thus it was that no sooner had Lawrence had called upon the company, which he'd not visited in half a year, than he was regaled with praise for the newly arrived priest, whose sermons he simply had to hear, as though they did not save her very souls. No, I can't register the sentence, I'm sorry. Still worse to hear as... Oh, still worse, the master of the Latparon company seemed to take Hollow in her robes for a nun on a pilgrimage and exhorted her to minister to Lawrence as well. Hollow took the opportunity to rail at Lawrence at length, occasionally grinning in a way that only he could see. After some time, their preaching ended, and Lawrence swore to himself that he wouldn't spare so much as a single coin for any honeyed peach preserves. Well then, that went a bit long, but shall we talk business now? I await your pleasure, said Lawrence, clearly tired, but the Latparon master had put on his business face now, so Lawrence couldn't let his guard down. It was possible that the master's lengthy sermon was a tactic to wear his opponents down, making them easy prey. So what goods have you brought to me this day? Right here, said Lawrence, regaining his composure and bringing out the pepper-stuffed sack. Oh, pepper! Lawrence kept hidden his surprise at the master's correct guess of the bag's contents. You know your goods, he said. It's the smell, said the master with a mischievous smile. But Lawrence knew pepper yet to be ground had little scent. Lawrence stole a sidelong glance at Hollow, who looked on amused. It seems I'm still a novice. Just a matter of experience, said the master. As far as Lawrence could tell from the man's broad, easy manner, his mistaking Hollow for a nun might also have been an act. Still, Mr. Lawrence, you always bring the best goods at the most opportune time. By God's grace, the hay grew well this year, and the pork has gotten fat merely walking the streets. Demand for pepper will be high for a while. Had you gotten here a week sooner, I'd have been able to take it off your hands for a pittance. Lawrence could only offer a pained smile in response to the cheerful man. The Latparon master had taken complete control of the conversation. He could now use strong-arm negotiation tactics. It would be hard for Lawrence to regain the upper hand. Traders like these in small companies were why the life of merchants was a hard one. Right. Right then, let's take its measure. Have you a scale? Unlike the money changers whose reputation depended on the accuracy of their scales, the scales that merchants carried were doctored as a matter of course. With commodities like pepper or gold dust, a small adjustment to the scales graduation could make a large difference. So both buyer and seller weighed items on their own scales. However, it wasn't every day that Lawrence dealt with high-priced goods like pepper, so he had no scales. No, I don't have a scale. I trust in God. The master smiled and nodded at Lawrence's reply. There were 2 sets of scales on the shelf, and he deliberately brought out the set farther away. Though he was careful not to show it, Lawrence initially sighed with relief. Be he the most devout, faithful follower of teaching of the church, a merchant was still a merchant. Undoubtedly, the first set of scales had been doctored. If Lawrence's pepper was weighed on such scales, there was no telling how much of a loss he might sustain. It could be as bad as a silver piece for every peppercorn. Lawrence gave God his thanks. Even if you believe believe in a just God. Man should be able to discern whether the scripture before him is true or false. A righteous man still trespasses against God if he commits a memory false scripture. After all, said the master, setting his scales down on a nearby table. He was probably trying to reassure Lawrence that his skills were accurate. Although merchants were always trying to outsmart one another, that didn't mean trust was never necessary. If you'll excuse me for a moment, said Lawrence, at which point the master nodded and took a step back. On the table was a beautiful set of brass scales, which gleamed a dull gold. It was the short of set one would expect. It was the sort of set one would expect to see in the office of a wealthy cambist in the large city, and seemed a bit out of place in this shop. The La Paron trading company storefront was so plain in the easily mistakable. It was easily mistakable for a simple home. And the only employees were the master and a few men. The interior of the shop was also plainly furnished, with two shelves situated against the wall, one holding jars that seemed to contain spices or dried foodstuffs, and another holding bundles of documents, papers, and parchments. While the scales seemed not in keeping with the rest of the shop, the balance of those scales was clear. The scales balanced in the center, with plates of counterweights to the left and right. They did not seem to have been tampered with. Relieved, Lawrence looked up and smiled. Shall we proceed to weigh the pepper, then? There was no reason not to think. Reason not to. Let's see, we'll need paper and ink. Wait just a moment, please, said the master, walking to the corner of the room and retrieving an ink pot. And paper from the shelf. Ink pot and paper from the shelf. Lawrence was idly looking on when a tug at his sleeve pulled him out of his reverie. There was no one else there. It was Hollow. What is it? I'm thirsty. You'll have to wait, said Lawrence shortly, but he immediately reconsidered. She was Hollow the Wise Wolf, after all. She wouldn't make a complaint like that out of the blue. There had to be some kind of reason behind it. Having changed his mind, Lawrence was about to ask her to explain herself when the master spoke again. Even the saints themselves need water to live. Would you like pepper, or would you like water, or perhaps wine? Water, if you please, said Hollow with a smile. Evidently, she had only been thirsty after all. Just a moment, then. The master left the contract paper, ink, quill on the table and walked out of the room, going to fetch the water himself. In this regard, he seemed to be no merchant, but a model for a devout adherent of the church. Yet, even as Lawrence was impressed at the master's faith, he gave Hollow a sidelong glare. I know it may seem like nothing to you, but as merchants, to us merchants, this is the battleground. You could have had as much water as you wanted later. But I am thirsty, said Hollow, looking away stubbornly. She hated being scolded. Despite her frightening intelligence, she could be strangely childish at times. There was no point in saying anything more. Lawrence sighed, and to chase away his frustration with Hollow, he set his mind on estimating how much pepper he had. At length the master returned, carrying a wooden tray with an iron pitcher and a cup. Lawrence's shame at having made a business associate and an elder perform such a menial task was very real, but the master's smiling face seemed to have dispensed dispensed with business for a moment. Well then, shall we proceed with the weigh? Indeed. They began to weigh the pepper. Also, Hollow looked on, leaning against the wall in a short distance away, iron cup clasped between her hands. The weigh was a simple enough task, with a set weight being compared on one side to the of the scales and the other being loaded with pepper until it balanced. It was simple, but if one grew tired of seeing the counterweight sink and was tempted to call it good enough and proceed to the next load, a merchant could unwittingly sustain a significant loss. So both the master and Lawrence carefully balanced each load until each was satisfied before proceeding to the next. For all its simplicity, the weighing was sensitive work, and it took 45 loads to finish. Pepper varied depending on its origin, but a load of Lawrence's product balanced roughly with a single counterweight. Would have been worth as much as one gold lumione piece. Based on this most current knowledge of exchange rates, one lumione equaled 34 and 2/3 trenny, the silver coin, commonly used in the port town of Pazio. 45 loads, and that rate would come to 1,560 trenny. Lawrence had bought the pepper for 1,000 trenny, so that meant profit of 560 pieces. The spice trade was indeed delicious. Of course, gold and jewels, the raw materials for luxury goods, could fetch 2 or 3 times the initial purchase price. So this was meager gain in comparison, but for a traveling merchant who spent his days crossing the plains, it was enough profit for some was enough profit. Some merchants would haul the lowest quality oats on their very back, destroying themselves as they crossed the mountains, and only turned 10% profit when they sold it in town. Indeed, compared with that, clearing more than 500 silver pieces by moving a single light bag of pepper was almost too savory to believe. Lawrence grinned as he packed the pepper back into its leather sack. Right, that's 45 measures worth, then. Where does this pepper come from? It was imported from Rampata, the kingdom of Lidan. Here's the certificate of import from the Mylon Company. Of import. From Rampata, then? It's quite a ways. Then I can scarcely imagine the place, mused the master, narrowing his eyes and smiling as he took the certificate parchment Lawrence offered him. Town merchants often spent their entire lives in the villages of their birth. There were some who would go on pilgrimages after their retirement, but there was no time for such things when they were actively working. However, even Lawrence, the traveling merchants, knew little of the kingdom of Lidan, save that it was famous for its spices. To get there from Pazio, one had to take the river all the way to the coast, and then board a long-distance sailing ship south across 2 separate seas, a journey of roughly 2 months. The language was so different, of course, and apparently the language was different, of course, and apparently it was hot like summertime year-round in Leiden. And the population was permanently tanned near black from the time they were born. It seemed unbelievable, but There was there was spice, gold, silver, and iron that supposedly came from the place, and the Milo Company vouched for the origin of the pepper, which the certificate claimed was Harampata. Was it a real country? The certificate seems authentic, said the master. The kinds of bills of exchange, trusted promissory notes, and contracts that passed through the town merchants were huge. Supposedly, they could even recognize bills signed by small companies in faraway lands, to say nothing of huge organizations that had their main branches in foreign countries. Recognizing the seal of the company as large as my loan would be the work of a moment. Signatures were important, but the soul of a contract was the seal. Right then, it will be 1 lumione per measure. Will this do? Can you tell me what the lumione is trading at currently? Lawrence was asked suddenly, even though he had some grasp of the coin's market value. Gold coin was generally used as an accounting currency. That is to say, it was the basis of calculating the values of many other currencies in the world. Calculating Calculations were performed in gold currency and then remitted in another. For more convenient forms, of course. In that situation, the market value of the currency in question became an issue. Lawrence was suddenly very nervous. Mr. Lawrence, as I recall you follow the path of Saint Metrogius in business, like your teacher did, correct? Yes, perhaps it's the protection of Saint Metrogius that kept my travels safe and my business sound. So I presume you'll take payment in Trenny silver. Many traveling merchants wanted to repeat the successes of the past, and so rather than move randomly from one town to another, they trod the paths of the saints of old. Thus, thus it was, uh, thus it was that the currency they used at a given time was quite predictable. For the master of Latparon Trading Company to come to that conclusion so quickly meant he was very shrewd merchant indeed. In Trenny silver, he continued, the current rate is 32 and 5/6. The rate was lower than Lars remembered, but given this town's importance as a trade center, it was within the realm he could allow. The place the place where currencies from so many different places all converged, the exchange rate with respect for accounting currencies tended to be lower. Lawrence did the calculations in his head at lightning speed. At this rate, he'd get 1477 trenny for his pepper. This amount was less than he'd anticipated, but a tolerable price nonetheless. It would be a huge step forward in realizing his dream of opening his own shop. He took a deep breath and extended his right hand forward to the master. That price will be fine, sir. The master's face broke into a smile, and he accepted Lawrence's hand. A merchant's spirit were never better than at the moment of a successful contract. It was such a moment. Hollow cut in with a listless voice. What is the master? What's the matter? Asked the master worriedly as he and Lawrence looked to Hollow, who leaned unsteadily against the wall. In an instant, Lawrence remembered the sale of his furs to the Mylon Company and grew suddenly nervous. The master of Latparon Company was a canny merchant who managed his shop alone. Trying to outwit him was likely to end badly, Having Holo around didn't mean they had to try to trick their trading partners every single time. Even as Lawrence thought this, he stopped short. Holo was acting strangely. I'm dizzy. Holo held onto the cup as her unsteadiness grew worse, and the water seemed likely to spill out at any moment. The master walked up to her, looking worried as he stilled the cup and supported her slim shoulders. Are you recovered? A bit, thank you, said Holo weakly. Finally standing straight again with the master's help, she looked every bit the fasting nun suffering from a bout of anemia. Even someone who wasn't as devout as the master would have wanted to help her, but Lawrence noticed something strange. Underneath Holo's hood, her wolf ears had not drooped very much. A long journey will tire even the strongest man, declared the master. Holo nodded slightly, then spoke. I may very well be tired from the travel. My vision seemed to tilt suddenly. That won't do. I have it. Shall I bring some goat milk? 'Tis fresh from yesterday's milking, he said, offering her a chair and briskly going to fetch the milk without waiting for her response. Lawrence was surely the one who had any premonition that Holo was going to do something else when she did not sit on the other chair and instead went to set the iron cup on the table. Sir, she said. Sir, she said to the master, whose back was turned, I believe I'm yet a bit dizzy. Heavens, shall I call a physician? Asked the master, looking over his shoulder with heartfelt concern. Underneath the hood, Holo's expression was anything but weak dizziness. She feigned. Look here, it's tilting before my very eyes, said Holo, taking the cup and spilling a few drops on the surface of the table, whereupon it flowed smoothly to Holo's right and off the edge of the table, dripping on the floor with a small plip sound. What? Lawrence walked swiftly to the table and put his hand on the scales. It was the same set of scales he'd carefully gauged the accuracy of earlier. If they were even slightly off, it would mean a large loss for him. And so he checked the scales' accuracy carefully, but they aligned perfectly with the direction in which the water had flowed off the table. This led to a single conclusion. The weighing was over, and the plates of the scales were empty save for the counterweights on them. Lawrence took the set of the scales and rotated the face precisely the opposite direction. The scales tipped this way, and that owing to the sudden movement. But when he set it back on the table, their movement slowed and eventually stopped. According to the graduations of the scales, balanced perfectly, despite the incline of the table. If they had been accurate, the reading would have been skewed by the slant of the table. The scales had clearly been tampered with. So then, did I drink water or was it wine? She looked back to the master, as did Lawrence. The master's expression froze, and sweat appeared on his forehead. What I drank was wine, was it not? Otto's voice sounded so amused that even her smile was practically audible. Oh my god. What a cunning wolf. Let's just say that. The master's face paled to nearly deathly pallor. If the fact that he used fraudulent skills to swindle merchants was made public, a God-fearing town like this, uh, in a God-fearing town like this, all his assets would be forfeit and he would face instant bankruptcy. There's a saying that no one drinks less than the master of of a full tavern. This must be what it means," said Lawrence. The stricken master was a cornered hare, unable to cry out even as a predator's fangs pierced its skin. Lawrence walked back toward the master with an easy smile. The secrecy to prosperity was being the only sober one, eh? So much sweat beaded on the master's forehead that you could trace a picture in it. "It seems I'm drunk on the same wine as my companion. I doubt that we'll be able to remember anything we've heard in here. Though in exchange I might be a bit unreasonable." "Oh, what do you..." The master's face shivered in fear. Taking easy revenge here would be failing as a merchant, though there wasn't even a mote of anger at being deceived in Lawrence's mind. All he thought were cold calculations of how much profit he could extract from his opponent's fear. This was an unexpected opportunity. Lawrence drew near the man, his expression still smiling, his tone every bit the negotiating merchant. "Let's see. I think the amount we agreed on, plus the amount you were going to gain, plus... Oh, you'll let us buy double the margin." Lawrence was demanding to be allowed to buy more than he had cash in secure. It's self-evident that the more money a merchant can invest, the greater the profit he can realize. If he can buy 2 silver pieces worth of goods with a single piece, he will double his profit, pure and simple. But to buy 2 pieces worth with 1 piece, he obviously needed collateral. Since the merchant is essentially borrowing money, the lender has the right to demand a collateral from the borrower. However, the master was in no such position to make such a demand, which is why Lawrence pushed such an unreasonable position. It's a third-rate merchant that doesn't take advantages of weakness. Uh, I can't possibly. You can't do it. That's a shame. I'm feeling significantly less drunk." The master's face was so wet it seemed to nearly melt as the sweat mixed with the tears. His face a mask of despair, he slumped in defeated. "As for the goods, let's see. Given the amount, perhaps some high-quality arms? Surely you have lots of goods bound for Reuvenhagen." "Arms, you say?" The master looked up, seemingly to see a glimmer of hope. He had probably been assuming that Lawrence had never planned to pay him back. "They're always a good bet for turning profit, a tidy profit, and I can get the loan back to you quickly that way. What say you?" Reuvenhagen served as a resupply base for the efforts of to subjugate the pagans. Any items that served in the fighting flew off the shelves year-round. It was difficult to sustain the decapitation losses when selling such goods. Since Lawrence would be able to purchase double the normal amount on margin, he'd have double the insurance against decapitation, which made weapons a good choice for buying for a margin buy. The master's face shifted to that of a shrewdly calculating merchant. Weapons, you say? Since I'm sure there's a trading company in Ruvenhagen with connection to yours, selling them there will balance out the books. In short, after Lawrence sold the weapons he bought with the money borrowed from the Latparon company to another company in Ruvenhagen, he wouldn't have to come all the way back to Perolson to return the money. In certain situations, the give and take of money could be accomplished with nothing more than entries in a ledger. It was the great triumph of the merchant class. What say you? At times, the business smile of a merchant could be intimidating thing. Even such, even among such smiles, Lawrence's was exceptionally intimidating, as he cornered the manager of the Latparon Trading Company, who was unable to refuse, finally nodded. My thanks. I'll arrange for the goods immediately, as I hope to depart for Ruvenhagen very soon. Understood. As for the valuation, I shall leave that to you. After all, I trust in God. The master's lip twisted bitterly in what must have been a pained smile. It was unavoidable that he'd appraised the weapons rather cheaply. Are you two finished? Said Holo, guessing that the strong armed negotiations were over. The master gave a sigh of dismay. It seemed there was still one person who wanted a say. I dare say my drunkenness is lifting as well, said Holo, her head tilting charmingly to one side. Must have seemed like a devil to the master. But she must have seemed like a devil to the master. Some fine wine and mutton would do much for my spirits. Make sure the mutton's from the flanks now. The master could only nod his head at the casual imperiousness. Make it quick now, said Holo, partially in jest, but hearing these words from the girl who adroitly saw through the doctored scales, the master turned around and scampered from the room like a pig smacked on the rear. One couldn't help but feel the master was overdoing it a bit, but if his fraud was made public, he would be ruined. To that extent, a little bowing and scraping for a small price to and scraping was a small price to pay. Lawrence would have taken a huge hit to his own assets if the trick hadn't been noticed. Poor little man, said Holo with a delightful chuckle, and made her even seem nastier. You certainly have a keen eye, as usual. I didn't notice a thing. I'm beautiful and my tail fur is sleek, but my eyes and ears are also keen. I noticed the moment we entered the room. I suppose he would have been sly enough to fool the likes of you, though, said Holo, sighing and waving her hand dismissively. Lawrence would have been happier if she'd said something sooner, but the reality was that he had not noticed the fraud, and the fact that Holo did had turned a great loss into a great gain. It wouldn't kill to be polite. I have nothing to say for myself, Lawrence admitted. Holo's eyes twinkled with unexpected meekness. Oh? You've matured a bit. I see you've matured a bit. Lawrence, indeed having nothing to say for himself, could smile chagrined. There is something known as spring fever. It's the most common during the winter in places far from rivers or seas. As streams freeze and the people survive on salted meat and stale bread day in and day out. It's not that no vegetables can survive the frost, but rather that such produce is better sold than eaten. Eating the produce doesn't. doesn't does nothing for the chill, but with the money gained from the sale, firewood can be bought, and furnaces stoked. Eating naught but meat and drinking nothing but wine takes its toll, and by spring many have broken out in rashes. This is spring fever, and it's the proof of neglect for one's health. Naturally, it's well known that resisting the temptation of meat and the comfort of wine will spare one such fate. Eat vegetables and meat only in moderation. Such will the church's sermon be every Sunday. Thus, come spring, the sufferers of spring fever will often find themselves being terribly scolded by the priest. Gluttony is, after all, one of the seven deadly sins. Whether or not the glutton knows it, Lawrence heaved a long-suffering sigh, and at Hollow's overindulging, she burped. Phew, that was tasty. She was in high spirits after washing down the fine mutton with some fine wine. Not only was it all free of charge, but after eating and drinking her fill, she could curl up in the bed for a nap. Even the most extravagant merchant will, as a matter of course, think ahead and limit his excess, but not Hollow. Tapping her feet in the light, she had eaten and drunk with glee, only stopped to take a break. Lawrence reckoned that if it had been their travel provisions, she would have eaten 3 weeks' worth. And she drank so much wine he began to wonder where it was going. If she had turned around and sold the food she extorted from the Latparon master, she would have able to put a big dent in her own debt to Lawrence. This was yet another reason Lawrence was stunned. Now then, I dare say I'll take a nap, said Hollow. Lawrence didn't even bother to look at the source of this exemplar of depravity. In addition to squeezing some fine wine and mutton from the Latparon company master, Lawrence had obtained a large load of arms at a very reasonable price. He and his companion left the town of Proson without so much as waiting for noontime bells. Little time had passed since then, and the sun was just now setting overhead. With the clear skies and warm sunshine, it was perfect weather for a midday drink, followed by a nap. Owing to the load, the wagon bed was in a state of disarray. But with wine enough in her, Hollow probably wouldn't mind. The trade road that they took to Ruvenhagen was full of steep inclines and sudden turns. Just outside of Brosen, but smoothed out and gave a grand view as it slowly descended. The road meandered on. It was a well-travelled, which made for a firmly packed surface, with holes being quickly filled. Even though her quote-unquote bed was packed full of sword hilts, Hollow was easily able to nap on top of them and pass the afternoon away since the road was so smooth. Then there was Lawrence, who had drunk no wine and spent the day looking at the horse's backside, reins in hand. His jealousy made it easy for him to not look at Hollow. I ought to tend to my tail. Her tail was the only thing she was diligent about. She pulled it out of her robes without a hint of concern. Not that any was warranted. The expansive view meant there was no danger of being surprised by approaching traveler. Hollow began to comb her tail, occasionally picking a flea out or pausing to lick the fur clean. The care she took for with her tail was visible for was visible in her silent, single-minded attention to job. She worked from the very base of the tail, which was covered in dark brown fur, finally reaching the fluffy white tip, and suddenly looked up. Oh, that's right. What? Maybe when we get to the next town, I want oil. Oil? Hmm? I've heard it would be good to use on my tail. Lawrence turned away from Hollow wordlessly. So, will you buy some for me? Asked Hollow with a charming smile, her head tilted. Even a poor man would be hard-pressed to resist a smile, but Lawrence could only glance at her out the corner of his eyes. Figures larger than her smiled dancing before his eyes, specifically the depth she owed him. The clothes you're wearing now, plus the extras, the comb, the travel fee, the wine, the food. Have you all added them up? There's the head text when we enter town as well, sure. As well, surely you're not telling me you can't do sums, said Lawrence, mimicking Hollow's tone in Hollow's. But Hollow still smiled. I can surely do sums, but I'm still better at subtraction. She proclaimed, then laughed at some private amusement. Lawrence knew she was hiding some kind of comeback, but her manner was strange. Perhaps she was still drunk. He glanced at the wineskins that lay in the wagon bed. She'd taken the Latparon master for 5 skins, 2 of which were now empty. It wasn't impossible that she was drunk. Well, perhaps you should try adding up all you've used. If you're such a wise wolf, you should be able to work out my answer from that, right? All right, I shall, said Hollow with a smile and a cheerful nod. Just as Lawrence looked forward again, thinking about how nice it would be if she were always so agreeable, Hollow continued. You will definitely buy me some, she said. Lawrence cast his eyes askance to spy her grimace at him. Maybe she really was drunk. It was a very charming smile. Just look what happens to the wits of the proud wise wolf. When she has too much wine, muttered Lawrence to himself. Hollow's head flopped from one shoulder to the other. She fell drunkenly out of the wagon. She could be in. If she fell drunkenly out of the wagon, she could be injured. Lawrence reached out to steady her slim shoulder, and Hollow grabbed his hand with a quickness that was nothing short of wolf-like. Surprised, Lawrence looked into her eyes. She was neither drunk nor laughing. After all, it's thanks to me that your wagon bed was so cheaply filled with. You'll pull a tidy profit. Her charm had vanished. On what basis? I won't have you belittle me. Surely you don't think I missed you strong arming that master. I've a sharp mind, keen eyes, eh? But don't forget, my ears are good too. I couldn't have missed your negotiations. Hollow grinned unpleasantly, showing her fangs. So you'll buy some oil for me, yes? In fact, Lawrence had taken advantage of the master's weakness during the negotiations, and it was also true that things had gone just as Lawrence had hoped. He cursed himself for being so obviously pleased upon signing the contract. Once it was known that someone was going to make a lot of money, they were obvious targets for sponging and wheedling. It was human nature. Uh, uh, well, how much do you think you're in debt for me? It's 140 silver. Have you any idea how much money that is? And now you think I'm going to spend more on you? Oh, what, you want me to pay you back? Lolo looked at Lawrence with an expression of mild surprise, as if to say she could pay him back at any time she chose. There are none. There are none in this world who don't wish to be paid back money they have lent. Lawrence gritted his teeth and glared at Holo, enunciating his response carefully. Of course I do. Of course I do. If Holo paid back what she owed him in a lump sum, he'd be able to fill his wagon bed with more and better goods, which would mean improved profits, more investment, and a greater return. It was the very center of a merchant's world. Yet Holo's expression changed completely at Lawrence's words. She regarded him coldly as if to say, "Oh, that's how it is." Lawrence faltered at the completely unexpected change. "So that's how you've been thinking. What, what do you..." Lawrence would have finished with mean, but Holo's rapid-fire response cut him off. "Well, I suppose if I pay up my debts, that makes me a free wolf. I see. I'll just pay you back then." Hearing those words, Lawrence understood what Holo wanted to say. Some days earlier, during the sermons in Patio, Lawrence had seen the wolf form and retreated in fear. Deeply hurt, Holo tried to leave Lawrence, but Lawrence stopped her by saying he would follow her all the way to the north country to collect the money she owed him for destroying his clothes. "Come what may, you'll pay me back," he said, "so leaving me now won't get you anything." Holo stayed with Lawrence based on reasoning that making him come all the way to north would be a bother, and Lawrence had thought that the business about debt repayment was just a pretense for both of them. No, he'd believed it. He believed that even if she were to repay the debt, she would still wish for him to travel with her to the forest of the north country, though her bashfulness would prevent her from admitting it. And Holo was now turning the tables on him. She used the fact that the debt was his own pretense against him. A single word jumped to his mind. Unfair. Holo was truly unfair. In that case, I'll just I'll just give your money back and hie myself north, shall I? I wonder how Paro and Muri are faring." Holo looked away, purposefully letting a small sigh escape. Lawrence, at a loss for words, glared sourly at the wolf girl and sat beside him, and wondered how to retort. He imagined that if he was stubborn and demanded that she pay him now and go on her merry way, Holo would really do it, and that wasn't what Lawrence wanted. This was where he'd have to cry uncle. There really wasn't really anything charming about Holo. Lawrence stared at her, furiously trying to think of a comeback, but Holo looked away from him obstinately. Some time passed. "We didn't decide the due date for repayments. Just as long as I get it in time we arrive in the North Country. Will that do?" Some of Lawrence was still stubborn. He simply couldn't let the cheeky wolf girl have everything she wanted. This was as far as he could give him. He could give in. Wallace seemed to understand that. She slowly turned towards him and smiled satisfied. I should think I'll be able to repay you by the time we arrived in the North Country, she said, purposefully drawing him near him, and it's my intention to pay you back with interest, which means the more I borrow, the greater the profit for you. So you'll do it for me, yes? Hollow's eyes met Lawrence's and looked up at him. They are beautiful eyes, with red-brown irises. The oil, you mean? Yes. Make it part of my debt, but please buy it for me, won't you? The plea was strangely rational, and Lawrence couldn't think of a good rejoinder. All he could do was slump his head sideways, as if exhausted. My thanks, said Hollow, brushing against Lawrence's arm like a cat, asking for affection, which wasn't a bad feeling at all. He knew that was what Hollow wanted, and it was an unavoidable part of his long, lonely time as a traveling merchant. Still, really, did you haggle him down? Did you haggle him down, didn't you? Asked Hollow, attending once more to her tale as she reclined against Lawrence. This particular wolf could sense lies, so Lawrence didn't bother lying and answered truthfully. Rather, he put himself in the position of having no choice but to be haggled down. Yet the interest rate on the arms was not good. The most profitable method would to import the materials and then assemble and sell the weapons. As far as the business of selling completed weapons went, simply by going somewhere with a constant demand for large amounts of weaponry and turning a fair profit, the amount by which the goods could be bargained down was limited. Lawrence headed to Ruvenhagen for that very same fair profit. How much? What's the point of asking that? Hollow glanced up at Lawrence from the position leaning against him, and then looked quickly away. At which point Lawrence more or less understood. Despite her forcing of the oil, she was actually quite concerned about his profits. What? I was just worried about sponging off a traveling merchant who is barely scraping by. That's all. Lawrence tapped Hollow's head slightly at the nasty comment. Weapons are the best-selling product in Ruvenhagen, but many merchants will bring them into the city, thus the interest rate on them drops, and the amount I could bargain with him down is limited. But you bought so much, you'll come out ahead, yes? The wagon bed was not full, strictly speaking, but it was well laden. The goods were solid, and though the interest was low in comparison, Lawrence's initial investment, the actual material was nice indeed. In fact, the fact that he was getting double the material for his investment was icing on the cake. Like the saying goes, a raindrop raises the sea. And so Lawrence's gain might be second only to the profit of his pepper. In truth, the proceeds would be enough to buy more apples than would fit the wagon bed, so to say nothing of oil, but Lawrence had told Hollow that there was no telling what demands she might make. But if Lawrence told Hollow, there was no telling what demands she might make. So he held his tongue. Hollow, blissfully ignorant, simply groomed her tail. Looking at her, Lawrence couldn't help but feel a bit guilty. Well, I should think we'll make enough money to pay for some oil anyway. Hollow nodded, apparently satisfied. Still, now that I think about it, some spice would be quite tasty. Still, now that I think about it, some spice would be quite tasty, Lawrence murmured as he estimated the likely gain against the cost of the weapons. You've eaten it. I'm not like you, you glutton. I'm talking about the Prophet. Well, why don't you load up on spice again, then? The prices in Ruvenhagen and Perossen aren't so very different. I take a loss after paying the tariff. Then give it up, I say, said Holos shortly, nibbling the tip of her tail. If I could get a rate about like what I normally get for spices, or something, or maybe a little more, it makes enough to open a shop. Saving enough money to open a shop was Lawrence's dream. Though he'd made a sizable amount in the kerfuffle in Pazio, the goal remains distant. Surely there's something, said Holo. Say jewels or gold. Those are sure things, no? Ruvenhagen is not a profitable place for such things, really. Damn, how long is this? Okay, almost done. Perhaps catching a bit of the fluff in her nose, Hollow gave a small sneeze as she licked her fur. Why is that? She asked. The tariff is too high. It's protectionism. They levy serious taxes on all but a certain group of merchants. There's no business to be had there. Towns that weakened the foundation of commerce with this kind of protectionism were not uncommon. But Ruvenhagen's policy was aimed at turning monopolistic profits. Gold brought to the church in Ruvenhagen could be stamped with the church's holy seal, and such gold would bring safe travels. Happiness in the future, or triumph in battle, all by the grace of God. There was even gold for guaranteeing happiness in the afterlife. Money. Oh, there we go. In the afterlife, and it all sold for extraordinary prices. The church council that controlled Roofdagen concluded with the merchants under their power to preserve the monopoly. So taxes on gold entering the city were terrifying and punishment for smuggling harsh. Huh? If we somehow smuggled gold in, we'd be able to sell it for, 10 times what we paid. But the danger rises with the profit, so I've no choice but to make money bit by bit. Lawrence shrugged, thinking wistfully of the end of his road. In a city like Ruvenhagen, there were plenty of merchants who made in a single day what Lawrence had made in his entire life striving for. Spent his entire life striving for. It seemed unfair, no, worse than unfair. It was downright strange. Oh, really? Oh, truly? Came Holo's unexpected reply. Do you have some idea otherwise? This was Holo the Wise Wolf, after all. Do you have some idea otherwise? This was Holo the Wise Wolf, after all. She might have come up with some unheard of scheme. Lawrence turned to her expectantly. Pausing in her grooming for a moment, Holo looked up at him. Why don't you just sneak in? If she was always this foolish, it would be charming, thought Lawrence to himself upon hearing the suggestion. If that were possible, everyone would do it. Oh, so you can't do it. When tariffs go up, smuggling does, too. It's a basic principle. Their inspections are very thorough. surely a small amount wouldn't be found. If they do find anything, they'll cut off your hand at the very least. It's not worth the risk. It would be worth it if you were bringing larger amounts, but that's impossible. Holo smoothed her tail fur and nodded. Satisfied with her grooming, Lawrence couldn't see much difference, but apparently Holo had her standards. 'Tis true, she said. Well, your business is steady enough. It is well as long as you make steady coin. Right you are, but I seem to have a certain companion bent on wasting that same steady coin. Holo yawned, pretending to hear, not to hear the jibe as she squirmed to hide her tail. She rubbed her eyes and crept back into her place in the wagon bed. Lawrence had not. Lawrence hadn't been terribly serious. He stopped following Holo's movement and looked at the road ahead. Trying to talk to her once she decided to sleep was an exercise in futility, so he abandoned the prospect. For a while he could hear the clattering of weapons as she pushed them aside to make a place to nap, but soon silence returned, and he heard her sigh contentedly. Lawrence glanced back and saw her curled up into a ball, just like a dog or cat. He couldn't help smiling. He couldn't very well say what he thought for many reasons, but he didn't want to say it. But he didn't want to say her to stay with him. He did want to stay here with him. As Lawrence pondered this, Holo suddenly spoke. I forgot to say earlier, but the wine we got from the master, I've no intention of drinking it all by myself. This evening we must drink together. And enjoy that mutton too. Mildly surprised, Lawrence turned to look at her, but she was already curled back up. But this time she was smiling. Lawrence looked ahead, holding the reins, and drove the horse carefully, so as not to shake the wagon any more than he had to. Oh, that was a long chapter. Sorry about that. Even reading is tiring. So, yeah. Nice chapter, easing back into the world. This book learns you so much about how trade went in that time. Because if you think about it logically, this is... Of course, this wouldn't happen every time, like there are extraordinary situations, but they do explain the basics of trading and stuff like that with those things. For example, when they said looking for well-fed animals, because well-fed animals means that the town is doing good, that the meat is going to be good, which means spices will become more people will want more spices, which means the spice price will go up. But like those little things, you don't even think about it. But yeah, that's gonna be it for tonight. Another chapter done, so yeah. Yes. Tomorrow it's gonna be more Nekopara. Yeah. And Thursday more Yakuza. But yeah, I'm gonna play more Nekopara, destroy my voice again for as long as I can keep up with it. And then, yeah, Thursday, more Yakuza. Let's continue the story, some side stories. No Friday stream this week. I'm sorry. That's gonna be it. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope. I know I did. Though reading can be hard. Have a lovely evening, and I'll see you all next time. Have a good night. Bye bye.